I used to work the overnight shift at a truck stop off the interstate about 2 years ago. It wasn't exactly the safest job in the world, but it was steady work and the pay was better than most late-night gigs. I'd clock in at 10 p.m. and stay until 6 in the morning, usually stuck behind the counter at the little convenience store attached to the gas pumps. If you've ever been at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m., you'll know the kind of atmosphere I'm talking about. The buzzing fluorescent lights overhead, the smell of stale coffee that's been sitting on the burner for hours, and the weird silence that only gets broken by the occasional semi pulling in or the hum of the ice machine outside. Nights were mostly quiet, but quiet didn't mean boring. You saw all types: exhausted truckers, sketchy drifters, and people who just gave off a bad vibe the second they walked in. Most nights, I'd keep myself busy by restocking the coolers, counting cigarettes, or flipping through my phone when nobody was around. We had cameras set up on the lot, and part of my job was just to keep an eye on them. Not so much for shoplifters, but to make sure nobody was hanging around too long. Truckers would sometimes park overnight, but we had rules about loitering. There was one night in particular that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I've told a few friends, but honestly, I don't think anyone really gets how unsettling it was unless they've worked alone at night like that. It was a Tuesday night, dead quiet, no more than 3 or 4 customers over the span of 2 hours. Around midnight, I noticed a white pickup truck pull up on the far side of the lot, away from the pumps. It wasn't unusual for people to park there, but something about the way it rolled in caught my attention. No hesitation, no slowing down at the pumps, just straight to the far edge under a broken light. The truck idled for a bit, then shut off. I expected someone to come inside, but nobody did. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I kept glancing at the cameras. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but I had this weird prickling feeling like whoever was in there was watching me through the glass. Eventually, a man got out. Mid-40s maybe, wearing a ball cap pulled low and a jacket that looked a size too big. He didn't head toward the store right away. Instead, he walked slow laps around the parking lot, like he was stretching his legs, but it didn't look casual. He wasn't checking his phone or looking around. His head stayed tilted just enough that I knew his eyes were on the store windows, on me. When he finally came inside, he didn't grab anything. He just wandered the aisles like he was pretending to shop. Every so often, I'd catch him peeking toward the counter. After about 5 minutes, he came up and asked for a cup of coffee. His voice was flat, almost too polite. He paid in cash, exact change, and then walked out without another word. I thought that was the end of it, just another weird late-night customer. But when I checked the cameras again, I saw him standing beside a different vehicle. Not the white pickup anymore. Now he was leaning against a dark-colored SUV, smoking a cigarette. At first, I figured maybe he had a friend with him and they switched cars. But when I rewound the footage, the SUV hadn't pulled in. It was already there before his truck showed up. That didn't make sense. A little uneasy, I tried to brush it off and went back to restocking shelves. About 30 minutes later, I glanced at the monitor again and froze. The man was back in his white pickup, the same one he'd arrived in, but the SUV was gone. It was like he'd never been standing there at all. The next time he came inside, it was nearly 1:30. Same routine. Slow walk through the aisles, barely touching anything, then up to the counter with some gum. This time, he asked me if I worked alone. His exact words were, "Quiet place out here, huh? You here all night by yourself?" I lied and said, "No, my coworker's in the back." In reality, I was the only one there. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He just nodded slowly, like he knew I was lying, then paid and left. After that, I couldn't focus on anything but the cameras. He stayed outside for hours, moving between different vehicles. First the pickup. Then I saw him sitting in a sedan that hadn't been there before. Then standing by a semi-truck, even though I never saw him speak to any driver. Each time I blinked, he seemed to be somewhere new, always within view of the store, always angled toward me. Around 3 a.m., things escalated. I was counting the till when I heard the front door rattle, like someone tried to yank it open hard. My head snapped up, but nobody came inside. On the monitor, I saw the man standing right outside, just out of reach of the camera angle that covered the door. I could see the top of his cap, tilted down, like he knew exactly where the blind spot was. I locked the door after that, technically against company policy, since we were supposed to be open 24/7, but I didn't care. My nerves were shot. 10 minutes later, I caught movement on the side camera. The man was circling the building, not walking fast, not running, just slow, deliberate steps around the perimeter. Every time he passed a window, he'd pause for a second. I ducked behind the counter, heart pounding, barely breathing. When I finally worked up the courage to peek at the monitor again, he was gone. Not in the lot, not in any of the vehicles, just gone. I waited, staring at those screens for what felt like hours. But then, at 3:45, headlights flashed across the lot. Another trucker was pulling in for gas, and that's when I saw him again. The man was suddenly standing at the far edge of the lot, near the shadows, watching the new trucker fuel up. I wanted to call the police, but what was I gonna say? There's a guy hanging around my parking lot. People hung around all the time. Still, something in my gut told me this wasn't normal. I picked up the phone anyway, started dialing the sheriff's office, but before I could even hit call, the cameras flickered. For a second, all the feeds glitched. When they came back, every vehicle in the lot was gone. The trucker, the stranger, even the white pickup. Just empty asphalt under the buzzing lights. I sat there frozen until my shift ended, waiting for him to come back, but he never did. When my manager came in at 6, I tried to explain what happened, but she brushed it off. Said maybe I was tired and imagining things, but I know what I saw. I saw him switch from truck to truck. I saw him watching me, and I know the cameras glitched right when I was about to call for help. To this day, I still wonder what he was really doing there. Was he stealing vehicles, following truckers, or was he just playing some kind of sick game with me? I never found out, but I quit a month later, and I still can't drive past that truck stop at night without looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that white pickup idling under the broken light, waiting for me. I used to work the night shift at my university library. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was steady money, and honestly, I liked the quiet. Most of my friends thought it sounded boring, babysitting an empty building from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., but I enjoyed it. I could catch up on schoolwork, listen to music quietly at the desk, and every now and then I'd run into other students cramming for finals who would keep me company for an hour or two. The library itself was one of the oldest buildings on campus. 3 floors tall, all brick on the outside, and with that old book smell that never went away, no matter how often they cleaned the place. At night, it felt even older, the way the lights buzzed overhead, the way the vents rattled in the silence. You'd hear a creak across the room and swear someone was walking, but then realize it was just the building settling. Most nights really were peaceful. We'd have a few late-night students trickle in before midnight, then it would go dead quiet. After 2 a.m., it was usually just me. I'd make rounds every hour to check the floors, pick up stray books, and make sure no one was hiding out where they shouldn't be. It was during one of those rounds that I noticed something weird. This was around midterms, so I expected a few stragglers. I was on the 2nd floor, passing through the rows of tall shelves when I heard a faint sound, like the thud of a book being dropped. I froze. The sound came from the 3rd floor. That floor was completely closed after 11 p.m. The lights were dimmed and no students were supposed to be up there. I figured maybe someone had slipped past me earlier. It wasn't a huge deal, so I climbed the stairs. The 3rd floor was darker than the others, lit only by a few ceiling lights every 20 feet or so. The rest was shadows stretching between shelves. The air felt heavier there too, like the dust had settled thicker. As I walked through the stacks, I noticed something strange. 3 books lying on the floor, neatly stacked, right in the middle of the aisle. I picked them up automatically, but something about the way they were arranged bothered me. They weren't scattered, like someone had dropped them. They were stacked deliberately. I reshelved them and continued my round, not thinking too much of it. But 20 minutes later, back at the front desk, I checked the camera feed for the 3rd floor. The motion sensor light had come on in the far aisle, the same spot I'd just been. I stared at the screen, waiting to see someone walk by, but no one appeared. Just the faint glow of that single light in an otherwise dark floor. At that point, my nerves started buzzing. I decided to head back up, partly to check and partly to prove to myself it was nothing. When I got there, I saw another stack of books. This time, they weren't in the middle of the aisle. They were on the end table by the window. 4 of them, lined up in a row, spines facing out. The titles caught my eye. Night Terrors, Haunted Places, Paranormal Studies, Death in Folklore, all from the same section, but definitely not left there by accident. I didn't even touch them that time. I just stood there staring, trying to figure out if someone was messing with me. A lot of people knew I worked that shift, and college kids can be assholes when they're bored. Maybe someone snuck in and thought it would be funny to freak me out. I did a sweep of the whole floor, calling out softly, but nobody answered. I checked the study rooms, the stairwells, even the bathrooms. Nothing. Back at the desk, I tried to convince myself it was a prank. I opened my laptop and tried to focus on homework. but every few minutes I'd glance at the third-floor camera. Every time I looked, the motion light would flicker on in a different aisle. 1:12 a.m., aisle 3. 1:27 a.m., aisle 7. 1:41 a.m., back by the window again. Each time, the feed showed nothing but empty shelves. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Not just one book this time, several, falling in quick succession. The crash echoed through the quiet building. My stomach sank. I forced myself to go back up. When I reached the third floor, my throat went dry. In the center of the reading area, the books were no longer stacked. They were arranged on the floor in a spiral, each one placed carefully to form a crude circle. In the very center lay one open book, pages splayed, like someone wanted me to read it. I didn't. I gathered them up, shoved them back on the shelves, and tried to laugh it off. "College kids," I muttered out loud, though my voice shook. I made another sweep and again found no one. When I got back downstairs, I locked the front entrance, even though technically it was against policy at that hour. Something in my gut screamed at me not to let anyone else in. By 3 a.m., I was too on edge to sit still. I kept pacing behind the desk, checking the cameras. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The books weren't just being moved. They were being placed in patterns. On the camera feed, I could see the glow of the motion light and the faint shape of books lined up on the floor of aisle 7. This time it wasn't a spiral, it was letters. Crude, jagged letters spelled out across the linoleum. It said, "You." I swear my whole body broke out in sweat. My hands shook so bad I dropped the radio I carried on rounds. I didn't go back up that time. I couldn't. I just sat there at the desk, staring at the camera feed like it might suddenly show me who was behind it. At 3:40, the lights flicked on again. Another arrangement. This time the letters were clearer, stretched across 2 aisles. "See you." I thought about calling campus security, but I hesitated. What was I supposed to tell them? That the books were moving by themselves? That someone was spelling messages for me with library property? They'd think I was messing around or losing it. I decided to stick it out until morning. Every muscle in my body was tense. I kept imagining footsteps coming down the stairs, or someone leaning over the desk from behind me. The last straw came just after 5 a.m. The cameras flickered, not like normal static, but like they were being interfered with. For a split second, all the feeds went black. Then one came back on. The third floor, aisle by the window, and standing in the middle of it was a figure. Not a student, not anyone I recognized. A tall figure, blurred at the edges like the camera couldn't focus. It stood motionless, head tilted toward the lens. Then the feed cut out again. When it flickered back, the figure was gone. That was it. I grabbed my bag, left the desk unmanned, and sat outside on the library steps until the morning staff showed up. I didn't even care if I got written up. When I tried to explain, nobody believed me. The cameras had no saved footage, only live feed. The books had all been reshelved neatly by morning, like nothing happened. I lasted another 2 weeks before I quit. Every time I walked past that building after dark, I couldn't help but glance at the top floor windows, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching, and sometimes, I swear I still do. I used to work the overnight shift at a small diner off the interstate. It wasn't one of those shiny chains either. It was the kind of old, family-run place that had been around for decades. The neon sign outside only half worked. The linoleum floors were always a little sticky no matter how much you mopped, and the smell of bacon grease never quite left your clothes when you went home. Most of our business at night came from truckers, drunk college kids, or people just passing through. We were open 24/7. So the owners always needed someone to cover the graveyard shift. At the time, I was 20, broke, and trying to pay for community college. Overnight tips weren't great, but I liked the quiet hours, and usually my only company was the cook in the back. Her name was Marlene. She was in her late 50s, smoked like a chimney, and had worked there so long she probably knew every regular by heart. She kept me sane most nights, yelling out orders and occasionally sneaking me extra pie when it was slow. But then there were nights that felt different. It was one of those nights in early November, cold enough that frost formed on the windows, but not enough to snow yet. I came in for my shift around 10:30, and the place was dead quiet except for one trucker finishing his coffee. By midnight, it was just me and Marlene. Around 12:45, the bell above the front door jingled. I looked up from my phone and froze. A man walked in, but something about him instantly put me on edge. He was tall, maybe 6'3", wearing a heavy coat that looked a size too big. His hair was stringy and uneven, like he'd cut it himself. And the strangest part, he didn't look at me. Most customers at least glanced toward the counter, but he just walked stiffly to a booth in the corner and sat down, facing the window. "Evenin'," I said. forcing my voice to sound normal. No response. He didn't even turn his head. I grabbed a menu and walked over, because that's what I was supposed to do. As I got closer, I noticed his hands resting on the table. They were pale, long-fingered, and completely still. He didn't fidget, didn't tap, nothing. "Here's a menu," I said, placing it in front of him. He didn't touch it. "Coffee? Or something to eat?" I asked. Nothing. He just stared out the window, eyes wide and unblinking, like he was watching something in the parking lot. But the lot was empty. I stood there for a few seconds, then finally backed away. I figured maybe he was on something, or maybe he was just a weirdo passing through. Either way, I wasn't about to push it. Back behind the counter, I whispered to Marlene. "Did you see that guy?" She peeked out the kitchen window, squinting. "Yeah. Creepy bastard. What'd he want?" "Nothing. He didn't say a word." Marlene shrugged. "As long as he ain't causing trouble, leave him be." So that's what I did. But every time I glanced over, he was still sitting there. Same position, same wide-eyed stare at the window. The menu sat untouched in front of him. An hour passed like that. Around 2 a.m., another customer finally came in. A young woman, probably in her 20s, on a road trip judging by the luggage she carried. She sat at the counter and ordered pancakes. I was relieved to have someone normal to talk to. While I poured her coffee, I noticed her glance toward the corner booth. She frowned. "That guy been here long?" she asked quietly. "Couple hours," I said. "He's not eating anything." "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice low. "He hasn't said a word either." We both looked over at him. He hadn't moved an inch. When Marlene brought out the pancakes, the woman whispered to me, "I don't like it. He keeps looking out the window like he's waiting for someone." I nodded because I'd been thinking the same thing. About 20 minutes later, the woman finished her food, left a good tip, and hurried out. The bell above the door jingled again, then silence. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The man in the booth had finally moved. His head was turned just slightly. Not toward me, but toward the door where the woman had left. His eyes followed her car pulling away, and for the first time I saw his lips move. He whispered something I couldn't hear. I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. I looked at Marlene, but she hadn't noticed. She was wiping down the grill, humming to herself. I debated calling the cops right then, but technically, the guy hadn't done anything. He hadn't ordered, but he hadn't broken any rules either. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something or someone. At 3 a.m., Marlene stepped outside for her smoke break, leaving me alone in the diner. That's when the silence hit me. No sizzling from the grill, no clatter of dishes, just the hum of the overhead lights and the faint rattle of the heater. I tried to busy myself by refilling sugar jars, but when I glanced toward the booth, my heart nearly stopped. The man wasn't there anymore. The booth was empty. I spun around, half expecting him to be standing behind me. Nothing. The diner was silent and still. I checked the bathroom, empty. I checked the hallway to the kitchen. No one. I walked back to the booth, and that's when I saw it. On the table, where the menu had been untouched for hours, there was now something else. A small, folded piece of paper. I hesitated, then picked it up. In shaky, uneven handwriting, it said, "Next time." I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked out the window where he'd been staring all night. The parking lot was still empty. Marlene came back in a few minutes later and found me pale as a ghost, clutching the note. I showed it to her, and for once, she didn't have a smart remark. Locked the front door. We never saw him again, at least not that I know of. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving past empty diners or truck stops, I can't help but glance at the windows. Half of me expects to see him sitting there in the corner booth, staring out, waiting for someone to notice him. And maybe one day, he'll decide it's time for next time. Back when I was 19, I took a seasonal job working the night shift at a roadside motel. It wasn't glamorous, mostly minimum wage to sit behind the desk, check in the occasional guest, and make sure nobody trashed the place. The motel itself was old, 2 stories, U-shaped, with all the rooms facing a cracked parking lot. The neon vacancy sign flickered constantly, and the carpet in the lobby smelled like mildew, no matter how many air fresheners the manager used. My shift was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. Most nights were quiet. A few truckers, some families on road trips, and the occasional sketchy couple who paid cash and asked too many questions about the security cameras. I got used to it, but there was one night that still sticks with me. It was around 2:30 in the morning. I was sitting at the desk scrolling on my phone when the phone at the front counter rang. Not the cell, not the office line, the direct line from a guest room. I glanced at the panel and saw it was coming from room 6. That struck me as odd, because I hadn't checked anyone into room 6 that night. I flipped through the logbook just to make sure. Every room on the first floor was empty, except for room 3, where a long-haul trucker had passed out hours earlier. Still, I picked up the receiver. "Front desk," I said. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, like someone was right up against the phone. "Hello?" I asked, a little sharper this time. No response, just the sound of that breathing. I hung up, my skin crawling. I told myself it had to be some kind of wiring issue. The phones in that place were ancient, and half the time they didn't even ring properly. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same line. Room 6. This time when I answered, I heard something else, a faint voice. So quiet I had to press the receiver against my ear. It said one word, "Stay." Then the line went dead. I sat there frozen, staring at the receiver in my hand. I knew room 6 was empty. I had the keys for it behind the desk. Nobody had checked in there in over a week, and housekeeping had left it locked. I debated waking the trucker in room 3, but I didn't want to seem like some paranoid kid. Instead, I grabbed the master key and decided to check it out myself. The hallway was silent as I walked toward room 6. The lights above flickered, and the hum of the vending machine at the far end was the only sound. When I reached the door, I stood there for a solid minute, heart pounding, listening for movement inside. Nothing. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was dark, but I could make out the shapes of the bed, the nightstand, the ugly motel curtains. Everything looked normal. I flipped on the light. The bed was made, the bathroom door open, the TV unplugged, empty. I checked the closet, the bathroom, even under the bed. No one was there. Feeling stupid, I locked the room back up and went to the desk. Not 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Room 6. This time I didn't answer. I just stared at the blinking light until it stopped. Then it rang again and again. Every time, room 6. Finally, I yanked the phone cord from the wall. Silence. I was breathing easier when the sound of footsteps made me whip around. They were coming from the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the lobby. I grabbed the flashlight we kept behind the counter and stepped out just far enough to see the hallway. It was empty. But the sound of footsteps didn't stop. They echoed faintly, like someone was pacing up and down, just out of sight. Then, silence. I backed into the lobby and locked the office door. For the rest of the night, I sat there, heart pounding, flashlight in one hand, the unplugged phone in the other. By sunrise, I was convinced it was just my imagination. Lack of sleep, the crappy wiring, maybe even a prank. But when housekeeping came in later that morning, I overheard them talking. One of the women mentioned room 6. She said she hated cleaning it, that it always felt off. Another nodded and said she swore she'd heard the phone ringing in there once, even when it wasn't connected. I asked them what they meant. They looked at each other, then told me that years ago, before I ever worked there, room 6 had been the site of a suicide. A guest had checked in, never came out. They found him hanging in the closet 2 days later. Ever since, guests complained of strange things. The phone ringing with no one on the line, the sound of breathing, the feeling of being watched. Management never advertised it, of course. But the staff knew, and now I did too. I quit that job a month later. But sometimes when I stay at cheap motels on road trips, I can't help but glance at the room phones. And if they ever ring when the room is supposed to be empty, I don't think I'd have the courage to answer.